Ages ago, the world was a battleground. Fiends of all shapes locked in earth-shattering combat against dragons and Coatl, the celestial feathered serpents. The war raged for centuries in a terrible stalemate. If it was allowed to go on, all life on Eberron would have been eradicated, and all the life that was yet to be would be cut off, or worse, twisted into something terrible. This the Coatl saw, and they decided to spare Eberron at the cost of their species. In a vast ritual, the Coatl gave up their lives, and the Silver Flame was born. A vast field of radiant energy that bound the greatest of the fiends, the Overlords, into a demi-plane prison. Since that day, the Overlords have sought to break free from each of their prisons, and their minions across Eberron have sought to aid them by weakening the flame. But all is not lost, because you, whether you be a king or a simple farmer, can strengthen the flame with your actions, and one day, when you pass from this world, your soul can join the flame, adding your strength to the bonds that hold the end of the world at bay. Welcome to Khyber Shards, a 5th edition actual play show set in the Eberron campaign world. Today we're going to have an Eberron lore episode. We've had the Silver Flame come into play a lot more in our campaign as Pog has developed an interest and a connection there. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about the lore of the Silver Flame, its history, its teachings, and some of the just interesting things about it. And then I have a couple of listener questions that we'll go over at the end. So without further ado, so the Silver Flame is one of the most interesting religions in Eberron to me, and I think it's one of the hardest to depict. On its face, it looks like it's just fantasy Catholicism, and I think, unfortunately, in some Eberron books not written by Keith Baker, that's what it ends up being, nothing more than Catholicism with a faint medieval fantasy veneer. The reason for that is pretty obvious. Keith Baker uses a lot of the terms from our world's Catholic Church, bishop, cathedral, cardinal, crusade, in developing the structure of the church in the world of Eberron. But when we actually dig into the lore as he's put it down, we find that analogy doesn't hold up all that well. The first thing to understand about the Church of the Silver Flame is that it does not worship a deity. Whether the sovereign host ever existed or still exists is not of great concern to a follower of the flame. Also, the Silver Flame isn't an object of worship. Reverence, yes, certainly, but not worship. Following the Silver Flame is more about a moral philosophy with some religious trappings. And the flame itself is not a god. It's an energy field. It surrounds us, penetrates us, it binds the overlords in their prisons. According to Keith Baker, as I've just made obvious, the best analog for the church isn't the Catholic Church of our world, it's the Jedi. Defenders of the helpless from the terrible evils of the universe. The flame teaches a pretty simple moral principle in Eberron. When you act selflessly, helping others, and especially when you protect the helpless, whether from danger, exploitation, or oppression, you make the flame stronger. When you act selfishly, you weaken it. This is true even if you aren't a follower of the flame, by the way. For most of human history, this philosophy was not known to humanity because there was not a voice to speak for the flame to humans. The earliest followers of the flame were humans in Sarlona who were transformed by the Coatl before their sacrifice into the feathered serpent folk called Shulasakar, and they follow their voice of the flame to this day. Elsewhere, the Gashkala orcs in and around the Demon Wastes and Eldine Reaches have set themselves the task of quarantining the contaminated battleground of the dragons and fiends that is now known as the Demon Wastes. They have mountain fortresses along the border of the Demon Wastes, and anyone passing in has no particular need to fear them. But anyone wishing to come out may have a fight on their hands as the Gashkala seek to prevent the spread of demonic contamination into Eberron. But it was only about 600 years ago that human beings began to hear the voice of the flame, and the Church of the Silver Flame, as we know it in Eberron, was born. In 299 YK, one of the overlords, Bel-Shalor, broke his prison, and a great chasm of fire opened in the midst of the modern nation of Thrain. But a paladin of Dol Ara, the sovereign of light, named Tira Myron, had a vision in which a coatl warned her of the impending doom. Gathering her own adventuring party, Tira set out to face the demon, wielding her mighty blade Cloinjar. And empowered by the coatl, Tira faced the awakening demon lord. Plunging her blade through Bel-Shalor's heart, Tira and the coatl sealed the prison again, but found themselves on the wrong side, bound in the flame forever. When a follower of the Church of the Silver Flame hears the whispering of the flame, it is said that it whispers with Tira's voice, and that at the base of the great font of fire in Flamekeep is Cloinjer, the sword of Tira, still embedded in the earth to this day. But Tira is not the only voice that whispers now from the flame. Even though he was bound again, Bel-Shalor was now one with the flame. Followers now speak of the shadow in the flame, whispering to followers, tempting them to do evil actions for the greater good. For the cruelty of a zealot is Bel-Shalor's most insidious weapon. Indeed, some fear that Bel-Shalor's attempt to break free was nothing but a ploy to gain access to the flame and to do more harm by misleading its followers. After its creation, the second most famous event in the history of the church is the event known as the Silver Crusade, also called the Lycanthropic Purge. There had always been lycanthropes throughout Eberron and on Khorvaire, but they were generally few, and only sometimes were they dangerous. They tended to keep to themselves. However, in the 800s, something changed. The causes are one of those mysteries that has been left for GMs to decide in Eberron. Many have been suggested, from actions of demonic overlords to a particular arrangement of Eberron's moons, or a manifest zone developing in the Elding Reaches. But regardless, lycanthropes suddenly became much, much more dangerous and much, much more prevalent, especially in northern Khorvaire. Lycanthropes started attacking people for no reason, unprovoked, and spreading the condition of lycanthropy through the common people of northern Khorvaire. In response, the church launched the Silver Crusade to fight back the plague. And eventually the rampage was ended by paladins of the Silver Flame, but by that point, the Shadow in the Flame was already at work. Some of the crusading paladins turned their zealotry against the shifter communities, or hunted down lycanthropes who posed no threat to anyone. A sect within the church known as the Followers of the Pure Flame rose to power during this time. Eventually, an end was declared to the crusade, and the Pure Flame was forced to relent. But the Pure Flame is still prominent in the north and still agitates for further actions against shifters and lycanthropes. 100 years ago, when the last war came, it initially went quite badly for the nation of Thrain, and in 914, when the king died, the people rejected his son and turned to the church to lead them, ushering in the theocratic rule of Thrain. The head of state in Thrain is now the keeper of the flame, though the descendant of the royal line is still a person of prominence known as the Blood Regent. But the keeper of the flame acts as leader of the church and spiritual guide to the nation, and is chosen directly by the voice of the flame and merely recognized by the Council of Cardinals, who will aid them in this task. The keeper today is one of the most unlikely keepers ever, because she is an 11-year-old girl named Jaela Duran. She was a peasant, daughter of a simple craftsman, who was recognized as the new keeper 5 years ago. Within the walls of Flamekeep, this 11-year-old girl, where her connection is the strongest, is the most powerful cleric in the world of Eberron. She has been a voice for moderation and compassion within the flame, within the church, in competition, essentially, in struggle with the followers of the Pure Flame, who still have a lot of prominence and tend to be the more militant group. Followers of the Flame gather in their churches to listen to the guidance of the Flame, to hear priests and clerics speak about the heroes of the church, and to find inspiration in their examples. Many practice archery as a form of meditation, and the longbow is the favored weapon of the faith. Many Silver Flame paladins wield bows and fletch their arrows with rainbow-dyed feathers in memory of the coatl whose sacrifice gave birth to the flame. Others meld arcane and divine magic to wield the raw power of the flame as silver pyromancers. In monasteries throughout Thrain, some channel the flame through their own bodies as monks who follow the way of the Argent Fist. All followers of the flame, whether warriors, priests, or farmers, seek to strengthen the flame by doing good and defending those who cannot defend themselves. But there is always that whisper, the shadow inside the flame that tells you that the ends may justify the means, that sometimes you must do a little evil to do a greater good. I think the Silver Flame is super fascinating, and I think the reason is that it has this contrast in itself. There is the very traditional fantasy idea of this lawful good church who seeks to protect the helpless, and the very basic stereotypical ideal of a paladin is represented in Eberron by paladins of the Silver Flame. But contained within that great act of heroism that brought the church into existence in the sacrifice of Tira Myron is also this danger with the demon lord Belshalor now having a connection to the flame that allows him to whisper into the minds and hearts of followers of the flame, and really plays into Eberron's kind of moral grayness by presenting this notion that the greatest evil that can be done, the best service to the demon lord Belshalor, would be to take your zealotry and exercise it without compassion, to exercise evil for the greater good. And I think that provides a lot of options for player characters who are playing followers of the Silver Flame to deal with moral tension in their character. And I think it's a way to make a really traditional paladin character just really, really interesting. So one of the questions that was asked from Emily is, I think you've stated before that you aren't a fan of the portrayal of the Church of the Silver Flame in Faiths of Eberron. Which sourcebook's portrayal do you enjoy the most? Okay, so Faiths of Eberron, like a lot of the, or not a lot, but like some of the old 3.5 sourcebooks, isn't authored by Keith Baker. Now, I don't mean to say it's a useless book. I mean, I've got it right here. See? It's a great book. It's got a lot of really interesting things, and it provides a lot of neat little details into a lot of the religions, including things like holidays and interesting practices. For me, the problem with its portrayal of the Silver Flame is that it just feels too much like all you've done is fantasy Catholicism. Yeah, I mean, you have a lot of the trappings of medieval Christianity in the way that the church hierarchy is organized, and the fact that people meet in things called cathedrals, and we had a crusade, and all these things. Medieval Christianity is certainly an analog for the structure of the flame, but the flame's teachings are distinct from that, and it's got a different kind of baggage from medieval Christianity. And I think that the way that Faith of Eberron does the Silver Flame is a little bit simplistic in that way. And that's why I don't prefer that. I really like the things that Keith Baker has written about the Silver Flame on his blog. I think that the Rising from the Last War sourcebook, the more recent one, does a better job of kind of presenting the nuance of the flame and the idea of the Silver Flame as much more about moral philosophy and moral behavior rather than being about a deity. The best is Exploring Eberron, which is an unofficial source book from Keith Baker that came out a little while ago and has a really great detailed chapter that provides, I think, a lot more useful guidance on playing someone who's a follower of the Silver Flame. Faiths of Eberron presents a lot of ideas on how you can run an organized religion for the Silver Flame, but as far as useful for a GM and way more useful for a player, I think Exploring Eberron has the best take on the Silver Flame. It gives you a lot of hooks and ways that your character can be active in the Silver Flame. Obviously, I'm an archery buff. I'm an archer myself, and I love the fact that the Silver Flame practices archery as a meditative and activity, and I think that should open up the options for archery for paladins in a lot of Eberron settings, even though that's not typically the way that D&D has worked. And that's another, like, just little things like that get left out of some of the source books, like Forge of War, which is a kind of a famously not great source book on the last war for Eberron, claims that Thrain was ill provided in archers, in spite of the fact that almost everyone in Thrain worships the Silver Flame and therefore practices archery. And so it just seems like a lot of the things that got into the Silver Flame in any kind of detail in the old 3rd edition official sources kind of felt like they just didn't really get what Keith Baker was presenting in the church and went with, oh, I get it. It's fantasy Catholicism from the Middle Ages. Let's go. So I think that's what I don't like very much about it. I like the much more philosophical, well, Jedi-like presentation of the Silver Flame that we tend to see in things that Keith Baker has authored. But my favorite is certainly Exploring Eberron. I think that's a really, really great one. Not related to the Silver Flame, but we did get a question from Darren. How do you figure out where to take things once you shake things up in a campaign with an event as wide-reaching as the Earthquake? You must have created at least a dozen new plot threads based on the aftermath. Is this a transition to a new phase/chapter of Khyber Shards? Thanks. It definitely does change the game. I kind of like this as there's kind of, I feel like, a point in a campaign where you need to shake things up, no pun intended there, as a way of preventing things from becoming routine. And I know that things hadn't become routine in this campaign. Far from it. The player characters had not gotten, comfortable and bored or anything like that. But yes, it definitely represents a chapter shift. And as we explore into the Earthquake in the next couple of episodes, more about the way in which it's a chapter shift should become pretty obvious. But yeah, I don't know that we'll dig into every plot hook that you could create out of this. I think Darren mentioned in the watch party that there's like a whole campaign in dealing with the aftermath. And there absolutely is. You could absolutely run an entire campaign that's just, this disaster happened, now go. But I mean, we haven't even begun to explore the consequences because it's been a matter of hours really since it happened. So our players are still very much in the immediate aftermath. We don't know what the human cost of it is. We don't know what the political cost of it is. We've only confirmed the safety of one of the Stormlords. So there's a lot of things that could have happened. And yeah, I definitely intend to give some space for the players to interact with the aftermath. I like this kind of shakeup, even though, I mean, it became really, really real with recent events in other parts of the world. That became, I really got, as I was editing it, I really kind of got a knot in my stomach. It was like, oh, man, is this, I don't know, in some way disrespectful when something like this, something real like this happens, when life imitates art, as it were. And I got really kind of nervous about it for a little bit. So it kind of sometimes makes me gun shy when things like that happen. Like I was running a game for my home group right before everything with COVID became obvious. Like, I mean, obviously it was going on, but we weren't really fully aware of it yet. And a major plague was a big part of that campaign. There was a pandemic in the world that they were interacting with. And after, lockdown started and all the things to try and deal with it, and you had so many people dying and people getting sick and hospitalized, and it just got to be no fun for me to run that because RPGs are escapism for me, at least. I enjoy them as games, but part of it is they're fantasy. They're supposed to be a little escape into another world. And so I just dropped it from the campaign. I had to talk with them. I was like, and everybody was cool with it because they were all feeling the same kind of thing of, I don't want this pressure on my fantasy character the way I feel it in the real world. This isn't quite like that. but it definitely made me feel a little bit shy about continuing to delve into it when you're watching it on the news with the earthquake in Turkey and Syria. But my intention is to allow some space for the players to have a hand in the aftermath. Part of what I like about this kind of event in a campaign is you are changing the context in which the players are operating. Up to this point, all of the social and political and economic structures of Stormreach have been more or less fixed, and the idea that the players could really force them in any one direction in any kind of big way was pretty limited. But when you create a scenario like this where everything is thrown into chaos and where some of those structures are going to collapse, I mean, the loss of the airship tower is going to be a huge economic problem for Stormreach. You open up space, particularly for players who are into the middle tier of play, for player characters in that level to start having a little more influence, being able to push things a little more in one direction or another. So it kind of opens up the political side of play, which is not all of my players' favorite parts of play. If I was going to guess, I would say that kind of political intrigue is really appealing to RA and Eric and less appealing to Casey and Colin. But it opens up that side of things, and I think that will be interesting. I don't necessarily have an end game planned for what Stormreach looks like in the aftermath, because I kind of want to see where the players take it. I know a lot of the things that have gone wrong, and I know what's become of most of the major players. And of course, because it's a D&D campaign, there's more to it than just an earthquake, as we will see pretty soon in the next couple episodes. So yeah, it definitely is intended to be a turning point in the game, and a shift to another chapter and another phase. And I look forward to seeing what the players will do with it. So, all right, well, we only had those couple of questions. I hope that this little lore summary for the Silver Flame was interesting. Thank you all so much for supporting the show by watching and subscribing and liking and all that stuff. You'll find links to all of our things in the description down below. Please do give us the likes and the subscribes, and share with your friends. In the meantime, new episodes of Khyber Shards drop Mondays, new Khyber Shards answers every Friday, and until next time, thanks for rolling with us.